Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's class, Still Life Painting using water mixable oils. I'm your instructor, Adrienne Hodge, and this is part 2 of a 2-part class. So if you missed part 1, you can find it on YouTube under the same title, but part 1 instead of part 2. And Ilse just dropped the link to that class in the chat. So if you missed it, still stick around and you can catch up later. I will review briefly everything that we covered last week, but we will be jumping in where we left off in last week's painting. Before we get started, I'm just curious if you want to answer me in the chat and let me know how many of you are using the water mixable oils. Because last week it seemed like when we held up the when people were holding up their paintings at the end of class, I noticed a few people using some different things other than water mixable oil. So I'm just curious. Laura said just started. Tammy says they're using water mixable oils. Okay, so we know at least 2 people. All right, and okay, Barbara is using water mixable oils. Great. Yes, I remember your example, Barbara. Okay, so that is good to hear. And if y'all have any questions about the water mixable oils, I'm happy to answer them. I mentioned that I actually spoke with someone with Winsor and Newton last week and asked a bunch of questions myself about this medium just to make sure that I was giving accurate information about it. So I'm, happy to share any information or resources that I can in addition to what the content of the class is. Okay, great. So yes, I see Lisa is also using it. And then if you're using, watercolor or some other painting material tonight, then obviously there's going to be a lot of content in the class that doesn't necessarily apply to the medium that you're using, although a lot of painting mediums do have similar processes as far as you're going to have more control if you start out thin like we're doing. It looks like Kimberly is saying, this is so interesting. I just heard of it recently. Okay, that's wonderful. And I'm also curious how many of you are also using the same mediums that I have here. So we started last week using mostly the fast drying medium for the first couple of layers that we put in. And then tonight I'm going to be using the linseed oil for the water mixable oils and the stand oil. And if you purchase these from Winsor & Newton, my bottles are older, so they don't have this purple strip. The newer line or just the newer versions have a little purple strip across the products so that you know that you're getting the water mixable version, because it's easy to get them mixed up with the regular linseed oil or the regular stand oil that goes with traditional oil paints. Okay, so Laura says I have all 3. Yeah, just let me know in the chat if you're using these mediums. I'm just curious how many folks are actually using the same versions of the products that I have tonight. Just, as information to know what to share with you, or if you have any additional questions, just wanted to encourage you to ask them. There is no such thing as a stupid question, like I think people are very scared to ask questions because they think it's something that they should already know, or everybody, else knows it and they're going to be embarrassed if they ask it. I guarantee you, I've been teaching adults for 10 years now. I just passed my 10-year anniversary of teaching adults, and I've been teaching kids for a few years longer. So 15 years in education almost completely. And anyway, adults often are very scared to ask questions, but when they do, everybody in the class is always like, oh, thank you for asking that. I was also wondering the same thing. So please ask questions. It looks like Florence is asking, I have refined linseed oil. What is that used for? So it's just linseed oil. It might say refined on it, just like, your olive oil might say, different things on it. But I don't believe refined linseed oil is going to be too much different than regular linseed oil. It's just refined. Honestly, I don't know, what would I'm gonna have to admit, I don't know that, what refined would mean, but if it's linseed oil for water mixable paints, then you've got the right thing. Stand oil is the medium that is best for, that's the other one that I'm going to be using tonight. And it says on the bottle it's for fine detail and glazing. So it's really sticky like molasses. Linseed oil is basically what is in most oil paints. So every paint that you purchase is just going to be pigment plus a binder. And the binder can be acrylic, like an acrylic paint. It's going to be like a polymer binder. And then for traditional oil paints, the binder is oil. So it's linseed oil is usually the oil that is used as the binder for most oil paints. And then Donna's saying I'm using water soluble oils and I have all but the fast drying medium. Okay, great. So that's the one we used mostly in the first couple of layers. We're going to get into the other ones tonight. Barbara's saying I do not have the thinner, but I have the fast drying medium and the stand oil. Okay, so the fast drying medium can be used as a thinner. And in traditional oil painting, I often recommend using Liquin to thin it out. I should also mention that you can combine these water mixable oils with your regular oil paints. So they're very intermixable. The only thing that would be different if you mix them in with traditional oils would be that you would then need to use regular, you wouldn't be able to clean them with soap and water. You would need to use a product for cleaning the, like how you would clean brushes. And you're not going to have the benefit of using these is that you don't need ventilation, and it's okay to, breathe them in because you're not dealing with toxic solvents. Okay, I'm about to go over supplies altogether here. I realize I kind of went off on a little tangent a little longer than I meant to here. Is there a shelf life for the drying medium or the stand oil? I feel like it lasts several years because I know the traditional kind does, because I have had the same stand oil in my studio for many years and I still use it and it's fine. So you just want to keep it stored in a temperate space. You don't want to keep it like in a cold garage or too hot. You definitely don't want to put it, leave it in a hot car because it's flammable. A lot of like the traditional supplies. That's really what I mean. These I wouldn't store any kind of paints in like, anything above or below room temperature because they can just, like they can freeze and then they'll get really solidified, or they can, change their chemical makeup if they get too hot. But yeah, since these aren't used like with toxic solvents, I don't know how flammable they would be, but I still wouldn't test it. But with traditional oil stuff, definitely don't leave it in a hot car. Okay, so let me move on to going over supplies. So I'm using the Artisan Winsor and Newton Artisan is the water mixable brand, water mixable oil color, and I've got I'll go over the colors whenever we get rolling, making our remaking our palette from last week. And then I have 4 or 5 brushes here, and I have a nice flat brush, a round brush, a liner brush, and then a medium round brush. And that ought to get us through the class pretty well. And then, yeah, like I was just reviewing, I have these 3 mediums, the fast drying medium, the stand oil, and the linseed oil. So those are the 3 Artisan water mixable mediums that I'm using. And then I've got a Artist Loft canvas here that has sides to it because I painted the sides and we went over that in class number 1. I've got some palette paper here from Strathmore. If you don't have palette paper, you can use freezer paper, and I actually have freezer paper all over my desk here as a backup in case I go off my palette paper a little bit, or just to protect my desk from the the water mixable oils here. And then I have a sketchbook and some Artist Loft pencils that I'm used mostly last week. And I might review what I did with those, but we're not going to be doing any more drawing tonight. We're just going to dive right back in where we left off. So this is where we left off last week. We did our underpainting using a very thinned out, kind of syrupy wash of yellow, and using yellow to paint or to draw with a small paintbrush, and to sort of draw our sketch of this mango on there is a really helpful way to get started, because you can easily cover up your lines. You can redraw them if you need to in the yellow. And then we did very thin washes of our underpainting and started to fill in everything on the canvas. The goal is to get it covered as quickly as possible. And we really only did one layer. So I was saying we did 2 layers. We only did 1 layer when we didn't quite get to the shadow yet. But we have 90 minutes total for the class tonight, so we should get pretty far. We maybe will not get quite to this level of completion, but I can always talk about what I did to make that happen with the other example if we don't quite get there. All right, I'm going to set this aside and review our sketching to get started. So we did some little thumbnails last week. We talked about the contours of the surface of the mango. And I should mention that the reference photo of this mango was provided along with the supply list. If you're watching later on YouTube, you can click on where it says see more underneath the video description, and it'll list the full supply list, and it'll also list a PDF that you can click on and download that reference photo of the mango. And so we talked about how you maybe might have a different size canvas. So with my example that was advertised for the class, I used a square canvas. I'm just going to zoom my camera out a little bit here so you can see how that one is square. But then the other canvas that I purchased for the actual class tonight is actually a rectangle. So I did a few different sketches of the frame for our composition, and we talked about that a little bit. We talked about the horizon line being dropped down into the bottom thirds and sketching it out using the contour lines, and then we looked at the value shapes, so the shapes of the shadows and the shapes of the light. And with the case of this mango, looking at the value shapes is really a matter of looking at the color shapes, since there are these different areas of color on the mango that really coincide with the different value. Like down here in the shadows, we've got a darker red and a darker green, and then up here we've got a more of a limey green, and then we've got some brown here in the middle. We've got a lot of yellow underneath and orange. We talked about the colors that we see underneath because we really want to paint from the background forward. So noticing the colors that are beneath the other colors, you want to start with the background and work your way forward. So rather than starting with red, we start with yellow and then build on top of that with orange, and then on top of that with red. Rather than putting brown right here, we start with the green and then add the brown on top, etc. Okay, so we created a little palette and we put little swatches in a sketchbook, or maybe you did it on a separate piece of canvas or canvas paper. And we're gonna do all of this again because we need to get our colors mixed up again. If you happen to still have your palette mixed up from last week, then great, but I'm gonna have to go ahead and create those all again. So I'm gonna do that now. Set this aside and pull out my palette paper. And then once we have these mixed up, we'll be ready to dive back in with those layers that we left off with. And I think it's really beneficial to have your palette pre-mixed before you start painting. That way you just know all the colors that you're going to have to mix throughout the course of the painting. And, we're doing this one together, but even when you're painting on your own, I always recommend that folks do that because that is one of the top things that causes a person to give up on the painting process is struggling to mix and match colors. So doing this ahead of time and having all of your colors figured out can be really helpful. Okay, so I've got two different yellows, two different reds, and two different blues. Each one is going to be helpful to getting different types of secondary colors. Like we're going to be able to get a variety of greens because we have two different, yellows and blues. We're going to be able to get two different kinds of oranges because we've got two different yellows and two different reds, etc. So it's good to not just have one set of primaries, but two sets of primaries. And this is the primary palette that was suggested on the Winsor Newton website for the Artisan water-mixable oil colors. Right, so the reds, or sorry, I guess I should say the yellows that I have are cadmium yellow hue, lemon yellow, and then I've got the permanent rose, and then the cadmium red hue. And then for the blues, I have phthalo blue, and French ultramarine. Then I have the titanium white, which is going to be the most opaque white of all of the whites. And then I have ivory black. Okay, so I decided not to mess with my background too much more, but one thing I do want to do is at least cover up where I left the yellow line for the horizon, or the little split in the backdrop back there where the table ends and the backdrop behind it starts. And then we need all these different bluish grays for the shadows. So we are going to need to go ahead and mix up these blue grays again, even if we're not going to be doing too much more on the backgrounds. Although you are welcome to add more layers to your background. Forgot to mention that also we'll need some water cups and paper towels, and I've got both of those things here. And when you're not using your paintbrushes, you want to keep them face down in your water cup. If you leave them sitting out on your desk, then they are likely to dry out. Okay, so I'm going to take my small round brush to mix up colors here. And the first thing I'm going to do is make a gray. So I'm going to take a little bit of my white off to a separate part of the palette and slowly add a little bit of black to it to get it to be a nice light gray. Let me just scooch this over so it's a little more central under my camera here. It's always easier to slowly add the darker color to the lighter color. Start with the lighter color and add the darker color. If you start with the black and add white, the black is going to just absorb the white. The darker color will always eat the lighter color. So you have a little bit more control that way. And then it's good to clean your paintbrush in between picking up some other colors so that you can keep your colors separate. You don't contaminate them too much, but I always start to break down with that a little bit. And I can't recall if I added this blue or the other blue. Looks like it was the French ultramarine. Or at least that is the French ultramarine. Let me see what kind of gray I get when I do that. I think that's a nice gray. Let's see if I can flip this over, get these a little more side by side here. You can try it out with the different blues that you have and see which one was the one that you used before, or just which one you like better if you're just starting out with this. Yeah, that's the phthalo blue. And I'm already starting to mix all of my white up here. So that's with both of the blues, but I think it was the French ultramarine was the one that was a little closer to what I wanted. And if it's looking too blue, you might have to add a little bit more black to it to get it to be a little more gray. And then we're looking for a few different shades of this. So we need it to be darker for the darkest parts of the shadow. Might just go ahead and use both blues in there. Starting to think that's what I did before. Okay, and then we need one that is pretty dark, so a bit more black, and French ultramarine blue ought to get us there. And I'm just leaving that gray I already had on my brush. And then just mixing it up a little darker. I'm just slowly adding a little bit more of each color here until I get that darker version. Okay, that looks pretty good. That's our shadow colors. And then for our mango, we're looking for a couple of different yellows. You can paint the yellow, just the yellows by themselves, and see if that might work for you. You want to clean all the blue off of your brush before you do that, or else it's going to turn your yellow green, which is happening to me a little bit. So I'm going to paint the bottom of my cup to try to get all that blue off. Maybe paint my paper towel a little bit as well. Okay, and then we're going to mix these yellows together. First, let me paint the other one. So that's the lemon yellow that I just painted with. And then this is the cadmium yellow hue. It has a little bit more of an orange. Feeling to it. And if I put these together, another kind of yellow. And then if I were to add some white to that, I'll get something that feels a little peachy, and there's definitely something peachy happening on our mango here in some spots. Although that's still not peachy as much as I want it to be. So I'm going to take a tiny bit, just a baby's breath of this permanent rose and mix that in there. And that'll give us something that feels more peachy. I think we made that last week. If we didn't, we did not quite make something that looks like that peach, but definitely we want to get some of that peach in there for these later layers. So make sure you've got that peach color on there. It was basically just white with both of the yellows, and then just a baby's breath, just a tiny little touch of that permanent rose added to it, and that should give you that peach color. Okay, and then go ahead and paint our reds by themselves just to see what they look like without anything added. So that's the permanent rose. And then the cadmium red hue is going to have a little bit more like an orange to it, maybe like a fire engine red. And then you can mix those together if you'd like to see what that looks like. We've got a couple of different oranges and reds happening on our mango, so you might want both of those together and separate. So like, let me mix some of the cadmium red hue with some of the permanent rose and see what I get. So just somewhere in between the two of those. And then we need a violet for our shadows. So we're going to create a violet using our cadmium red hue and the French ultramarine. And you can see how I'm already breaking my own rule about not contaminating these colors. That's one of those things that I'm always like, do as I say, not as I do. Like if you want to keep your piles, you know, pure, then it's a good idea to not mix those together too much. But we're looking for a nice deep purple here. Oh, I just realized I went off screen slightly with some of these colors I've been mixing. Sorry, y'all. So I just mixed up this. I just lifted it up. I see somebody was commenting about that in the chat there. So now you should be able to see that purple that I just mixed. It looks very dark black on the Zoom. The Zoom lighting is not amazing for picking up subtleties like that. But I mixed the French ultramarine blue and the permanent rose to get a nice deep purple to happen. So very similar to that purple I already mixed last week, which looks black on the Zoom, but I show you it's got a purple hue to it. And then we're looking for a few different greens here. So we want one that feels very grassy, foresty green. So we'll take some of the lemon yellow and mix the French ultramarine with that. We should get a nice irishy, grassy green, like a Kelly green. That's what I'm seeing at the edge of the mango. So something like that. Wow, that's really not showing up. Let me get my light to tilt down a little bit here, see if it can pick up these colors a little better for y'all. That's still not amazing. Hopefully once I Let me scoot over a little bit more. Still not showing up. Well, hopefully when I paint it, it'll show up green on the paper. It definitely will on the canvas. Okay, so I've got that foresty green there. Okay, and then we want a green that has a little bit more of an earthy feeling to it. So we're going to try adding a little bit of this cadmium yellow hue to it and see what happens. And that should do it. That should give it that kind of earthy green. I'm gonna feel like a dirty green there. Okay. And that have kind of a brownish hue to it. And yeah, I guess that's the one thing we didn't make was a brown last week since we didn't need that yet. And I guess I just forgot, but let's mix up a little bit more of this green. So I'm going to make a bigger pile of green over here with my lemon yellow and my French ultramarine blue. I'm looking for that foresty green. And then we're going to mix some red with that. Get a brown. You're going to really mix it up. It might not look brown right away. It might have kind of a reddish feeling to it, in which case we need a little more green. I'm going to make even more green. That was clearly too much red. All right, there we go. So now we've got a nice chocolatey brown. And that'll be the detail that we add. And for those like black specks that we're seeing on the mango, you can use black or you can use this deep purple instead of black. And that'll just keep it from being too stark. But the regular black should be pretty okay. Okay, so we may have to mix up more of these colors as we go, but at least now we know how to make all of these colors happen, so it shouldn't be too hard to mix them again. Let's set my color palette aside and get my paper palette aside. Not my palette paper, not to be confused with my palette paper, but just the one that I was painting my color swatches on. That's what I'm setting aside. Okay, and we're ready to start adding more layers to this. So first thing I want to do is finish that first layer with the shadow. And let's see, we are 35 minutes in, but we spent some time on some Q&A at the beginning, which I feel like was important stuff. So I'm not too worried about it. And we're going to get as far as we get here. So I need to make more of this gray. So I'm going to squeeze out quite a bit of those colors that I need to make more gray. I'm going to use a bigger brush to mix it up here. So I can try to fill in these shadows fairly quickly. So I started with my white, and then I'm adding black to that to get gray, and I added a little more black than I meant to. I'm just going to go ahead and make a huge pile of gray here with all of that white, and then some blue to get it to be that bluish gray. And then even more. I'm just going to kind of try to make these 3 different grays within this pile here. I need the darker one, the medium one, and the lighter one. Yeah, as I was saying before, in the painting classes that I teach, a lot of times people give up on the painting process because they get overwhelmed with what they have to do next and they don't know what they if they don't know what to do next, that is more likely to happen. So if you don't know how to mix up a certain color or you don't know how to render the thing, so that's why sketching it is so helpful before you begin the painting, because that can help you answer those unknowns. If we mix up all of these colors beforehand, it may seem tedious, but I always joke that the painting just paints itself after this because we've already done the hard work of mixing the colors, which is the thing that causes people to give up the most. The other thing that causes people to give up the most is being unable to render it, to get it to look, three-dimensional, or the texture, whatever aspect of the form that they're trying to paint. And oftentimes sketching it just to get more comfortable with it could alleviate those fears. But again, people will just put it down and just not pick it back up because that can feel scary. All right, I'm going to use the fast drying medium again, and I see Trish is asking what paint colors were used to make the chocolate brown. It was red and green. So I used the lemon yellow and the French ultramarine to make the green. And then I added the permanent rose red to that. And then that got brown. And if you need help with color mixing, I had a class back in November last year that you can find on YouTube called Color Theory Basics Part 1 and 2. And Ilse can drop the links to those classes in the chat. And if you're watching later on YouTube, you can search those keywords and find that. And we mixed up brown using a variety of neutral browns using complementary colors in that class. We were using acrylic paint, but it's the same color mixing across all the paints. It's just going to vary a little bit depending on the colors that you're using between brands. Okay, so I am going to use some of this fast drying medium and add it to my gray here that I just made. So I'm going to take it and just pour it direct. I'm going to do it over here so it's not over my painting. Let me see if I can get it to be on screen at least while I do it. So I'm just pouring that over on my paintbrush, mostly just to keep it from dripping across my table too much. And I'm adding that to my gray to thin it out. And you can also add some water to thin it out if you don't have that fast drying medium. You do have to be careful, like, to try to balance out, like, not too much water or not too much of the fast drying medium. It can start to do kind of a weird coagulating thing if you mix too much of both of those together. Okay, and then while it's nice and thin, it's a darker shade for this shadow. I can always go over this with a lighter layer too. So the thing about paint is not permanent. And a lot of people are also scared of painting because they feel like every brushstroke has to be perfect, every color has to be perfect, and like it can't be painted over. Even if you go too thick with your paint and you want to take it out and start over, you can. You can wipe it out with a paper towel. Sometimes I've even used sandpaper to get paint off of a canvas. Might even have my little block of sandpaper nearby. I don't know if I put it away. But yeah, one of those little soft, like spongy, it's not a sponge, but it looks like a little brick that they sell, like a little foamy thing with sandpaper on each side that they sell at Home Depot. That can be really helpful, even if paint is dry, getting it off of a canvas so that you can start again. Or you can paint over it. When it's completely dry, you can easily paint over anything. So don't be scared of paint. It's not permanent. So I'm keeping it pretty thin. And I can even go ahead and go into my darker part of this shadow with the same version of this gray, but I'm going to go ahead and make my darker gray and add a little bit more black and a little bit more blues. Get this to be the darkest blue gray that it can be. And then I'm also adding the fast drying medium again. And the purpose of keeping, I talked about this a lot last week, is using the using the thinner layers in the early stages, allow things to dry. Like this is almost dry enough that I can touch it. Like it's still a little cold and it's still a little sticky in some spots, but that is almost completely dry. And if we went super thick with this, it's going to take weeks to dry. But since I went so thin, it's dry enough that I can touch it. Like it still feels sticky, but none of it's coming off on my hands. That is the reason why you use that fat over lean rule. That's why you go super thin with your early stages, because then you just have more control, you have more opportunities to build on that. It's just easier for you in the long run. And I'm not saying that you should never start painting with thick paint in the beginning. Like I even had a conversation with my private lesson student that I was teaching earlier today. We were using gouache and she was saying, I've seen a lot of illustrators use really thick gouache right off the bat. Like they don't thin it out like this first. And I said, yeah, you can always do whatever you want. Like I'm not the boss of you. The way that I teach is a process to try to build confidence in my students. Like I'm trying to give you an easy process that you can use to build confidence in your skills so that you can practice and not run into too many pitfalls. If you use thick paint to start, you're very likely to run into some pitfalls. You're going to have less control because you're going to be stuck. You're going to have to either wait for that first layer to dry enough to be able to layer on top of it, or you're going to have to really know what you're doing to make everything you do next work out on the first try so that you don't upset that still wet layer that you have, you know? So it's easier to do what we did last week to just make it super thin because now we've got kind of a clean slate to work on top of. These colors are not going to mix with the next color that I add. I'm going to be able to continue to build. And like, yes, the next layer that we add is going to be wet, but the layer that we add after that, but you're just going to have more control over what you do if you keep it thin to start. So that's the whole reason I say that. It's not like you only have to do it that way, or, I'm saying doing it any other way is wrong. And you can always do whatever you want. And I honestly think the movies are to blame for a lot of people giving up on painting because, it's like anybody who's ever given birth to a child knows the way that a woman going into labor or a person with a uterus going into labor in a movie is always like super dramatic and it happens so fast and it's not the way that birth happens. And same thing with painting. You always see this actor or actress grabbing these thick globs of paint and just globbing all this thick paint, it's just thick paint, thick paint, thick paint onto the canvas. And, they get a little bit on their face and they're wearing an adorable shirt and like everything's just so, wonderful. And then there's lots of cuts and then it cuts to the painting and it's a masterpiece, right? Okay, well, that's not likely to happen for you if it's your first time painting and you go in with super thick paint. You're probably gonna have a hot mess on your hands. So yeah, I don't recommend painting the way that you see in movies. I recommend if you're new to painting, especially that you follow this fat over lean rule and you go super thin and you're just going to have more control over what you're doing. You're going to have more success. And if you're not doing that already, then you're probably noticing that you're running into issues. If you already went super thick, and then you're trying to layer thick paint on top of thick paint, it's just more likely to get muddy a lot faster. But after you've practiced enough and you're very confident and you know what you're doing, then you're going to be able to have more control over thicker layers. And I'm not saying don't ever do it. If you're a beginner, then I definitely don't recommend that you start with your thickest paint. Okay, let's get more on this mango. Well, actually, first I want to get just that yellow line covered up on my background, which is risky because I might not match my background color perfectly here. I might end up having to paint a little bit of another layer onto my background. Let me see if I can get a little closer. That is close enough. I'm going to just blend that in a little bit here. Not quite that same blue, but I think it's good enough. Okay, and yeah, in a perfect world, I would add another layer to this background here. I might just go in and just do a few moments to clean up some of those weird patches that I've got showing. I'm trying to keep my brush strokes nice and horizontal here. And if you've got time to spare, I would say spend your time putting another nice layer on this background, keeping it all nice and horizontal. If it's totally dry from last week and you don't match the color exactly, or even if it's still wet, you should be able to make it blend. Like I'm getting it to blend just by kind of finessing it a little bit into there. And I feel like it's at least covering up those patches, and I'm okay with there being a few visible streaks. It's just giving it kind of a fun texture in the background. And the more you thin it out with the fast drying medium or with water, the thinner, the easier that layer is going to be to control, to go over it with even a third or a fourth layer if you want. I really just wanted to clean up my background a little bit. Feels like more of a gradient than a horizon line there, but I'm okay with it. Okay. So I might even take my little bit darker blue. I'm like, oh, do I want to do that? That might be kind of risky, but like I kind of want to put my horizon line back in there a little bit and blend into that background one more time. Because I feel like that gives it a nice bit of depth. That switch from the light gray to the dark gray. All right, that's good enough. Okay, on to these greens again. So I need to make a lot more green. This is where I might just start mixing on my freezer paper that's underneath here instead of pulling out another sheet of palette paper, because I have it right here for this very reason. I'm gonna make a pretty big pile of my green. Adding some water to thin it out for now. But I do want to get some of this linseed oil going soon, just so that we can test it out. And I can show you what it does and how cool it can be. And when you go from like thin to a little thicker for these layers, you can just keep using water. You can just, thin it out a little less, like don't thin it out quite as much as you did for the first layer. Or you can use this linseed oil to get it to, so what it's doing is it's slowing down the drying, and it's reducing the consistency. That's what it says on there. It's also giving it just, a certain texture. So reducing the consistency and that making it a little bit thinner, but it's changing the consistency as well, I would say. I'm just pouring it directly on my paintbrush and then mixing it in. I'm going to test it out and see what that looks like. And I'm looking at my reference photo to see where that darker green is. I might want to switch actually to one of my smaller brushes. And remember, we're following those contours as we're adding stuff to this mango to try to get it to feel three-dimensional. All right, I really want to mix it up in there so that it doesn't do this weird coagulation thing. You really want to like get it to be the consistency that you're looking for. I don't want it to be too thin. I'm keeping it on the edge of the mango because that's where I'm seeing that color green. Down here at the bottom. Oops, I just grabbed some of my blue. But yeah, when you make any sort of mistake like that, you can just grab your paper towel and wipe things out. You could also grab some water and kind of scrub some water in there and then pull it out with your paper towel first. But I'm basically just trying to make sure that my brush strokes are following those contours that we talked about, that three-dimensional elevational shift in the contours. Okay, and then I want to switch to that dirtier green. So it's this same green, but we're going to add some of that cadmium yellow hue to it. And that's going to get it to be kind of a brownish green, this earthy green. You can add some more linseed oil to it if you want, if you've got it, or just make it as thin or as thick as you want with your water. And again, I'm noticing that three-dimensional elevational shift that's happening. I'm making my brush strokes follow that curve. And I'm still keeping it pretty thin because I want to be able to still manipulate what I'm doing. So even though I used that linseed oil, I'm kind of grabbing the linseed oil that I already have on there and moving it around into this color and letting it blend in to this that way. Because if I use too much of it, it might not be the consistency that I'm looking for. And this is going to slow down the drying time, but it's going to allow me to manipulate the consistency. And then the stand oil that we'll use on these last layers, it's really thick like molasses, like I said, and that's going to help us to get those I mean, it really, like, the word stand is a great way to describe it. It makes the paint kind of stand on top. Okay, so up here, I'm going to stop actually because this is where I want there to be more red and yellow shining through in this moment on the mango. So I want a little more of my red. And, play around with these different mediums and see what you think. Like, you might go back to the fast drying medium. But once you put the stand oil on, you want that to be like your last layers that you do the stand oil. So I just added a little bit more of the fast drying medium that was hanging out on my palette to my cadmium red hue here for the orange. And I might actually mix a little bit of the cadmium yellow hue into this to get it to be even more orangey. But I want the color that's underneath here to shine through, and that's really orange. But we still want that yellow to shine through as well. So this is where the linseed oil can also be really helpful because it can help it have that like transparency. So that the yellow shines through. Yeah, that's what we're looking for. That's what I'm looking for. And I'm still following those contours. I'm just paying attention to my reference photo to see where that little shift in the curve on the surface is happening and where the color jumps around. Maybe we have a little bit more of this orange down here. And you can see how the linseed oil just gives it like a different, just a different consistency. Not to keep overusing that word, but that's what it's doing. It's helping it be a little transparent. It's like making it thicker but thinner at the same time, if that makes sense. And sometimes letting things, mix together on the canvas can be nice. Like I'm grabbing some of that dirty green, or that earthy green, and kind of moving it around into these patches that I'm seeing here. Maybe I'll grab a little bit more of that limey green and mix it a tiny bit with the orange, which is going to give me kind of a brown, but maybe some of that orange will stick with it a little bit. How are we doing on time? It is 7 o'clock. Okay. I think we're in a pretty good spot here. So we want that yellow to show through in that one spot there where the highlight is the most, but we also want the orange to be kind of transparent over it. But also it's okay if yours doesn't look exactly like mine. If you really like certain colors on this mango better than others, and you really like how the green is looking, think of other mangoes that you've seen. They might be more green or more reddish or orange or yellow. So it's totally fine if your mango does not look identical to mine. Okay, so that thing just happened where I started to get it to like create these almost, I don't know how else to say it, but it kind of turns into little boogers whenever you when you make it too thin, when there's just not enough pigment. So when it's like too much linseed oil and too much of any of these mediums, and not enough paint, and then you add water to it, it starts to do a funny thing there. So if that's happening to you, that just tells you mix up a little more paint in there. So that's one thing that I've noticed about these water soluble oils, is that if you thin them out too much and then add water, it starts to do that funny thing. And it's not a nice look. At least I'm not into it. And it's also kind of hard to manipulate. So I'm just going to wipe that out where that was starting to happen for me. And I just mixed up more of that orange that I had and added more linseed oil to it. I'm just mostly trying to be careful because I want to preserve that yellow peeking through right there. Okay, and actually on my other example, what I did is I guess just decided to put some of that yellow back in and some of that peachy color, but I know I did that with the stand oil, so I'm going to save that for the stand oil part there. But I want to get some more red here on the bottom for sure. I'm just going to use my permanent rose kind of by itself. I might add a little bit of this orange I already have to it. That's already got all the linseed oil in it. And I definitely recommend taking your time with a painting like this, for the sake of showing you all of these layers and what I might do on the last layer. I mean, I picked a pretty simple subject matter on purpose, but I would play around with this for multiple layers. Like, don't feel like you have to jump to, these last layers the way I am as quickly as I have. If you want to just keep playing around and keep adding stuff, I accidentally grabbed some of that blue and decided, well, I wanted some purple there eventually, so I might as well let those kind of mix together, or the red and the green can kind of mix together and start to make a brown right there. And I'm taking my own advice and letting this mango be a little different from my other mango. But yeah, I'm definitely going faster with this process than I would if I was painting by myself. In fact, this was originally going to be just a one part class. And then I was like, oh, no way. I can't do all this in 90 minutes. That's biting off way more than I can chew. But even in two 90-minute classes, it's still hard to squeeze it all in. Okay, yeah, I used way more orange on my other example. I'm looking at the reference photo and realizing how rogue I went with this before. Okay, I want to get a little brown on there, and then we're going to play around with the stand oil. So I'm going to need to make some more brown. And luckily, I've got a ton of this green. And that's what I need to add to my red. Make brown. And if it's looking kind of violet, which mine is, I'm going to add some yellow to it. I'm adding some lemon yellow. If it somehow ends up looking kind of purplish when you mix, that's telling you that there was a lot of blue in your green that's mixing with the red and turning it, um, more violet. And so you can just add violet's complement, which is yellow, to try to neutralize it and get more of a brown to happen. And I'm going to use the linseed oil on that. And I just added way more linseed oil than I meant to. And that is about to drip down my desk. Definitely thicker here. Both thicker and thinner. I don't know how else to describe that. But if you're using the same stuff as me, if you're using those same mediums, then you're probably seeing what I mean. All right, I've been using the same paintbrush for a lot of this. I'm going to switch to my other paintbrush to get some variations in my lines. Not to say that using the same brush and having the same brush stroke the whole time is a bad thing, but I want some different brush strokes to be happening. So I'm going to switch to that bigger brush and then just kind of bounce around and add some other colors, some other layers of green and brown and red, just to get some variation in my brush strokes to happen. Still thinking about those contours, maybe going more vertical over those contours and then more horizontal. Just really getting that 3D nature of the mango to show up. Another tip about just brushstroke practice is, practice just doing like one little brushstroke here and there and then stopping yourself. Because that's another thing I think the movies have done to us is like they make us want to like keep doing that same repetitive motion over and over again, and that's not always necessary. Sometimes just one or two little brush strokes can have a huge impact. It doesn't always have to be, 20 brush strokes every time you lay down a new color. I'm kind of just jumping around and trying to tone down these moments where it feels kind of like the colors were pasted on a little bit and making them feel a little more organic in the way they're interacting with each other. And if that means maybe playing with the color and doing something that's not happening on my mango, that might be kind of nice. Another thing, I'm gonna grab a paintbrush from across the room real quick and do one more thing. So if you have any brushes that you don't care about that have like gotten kind of messed up and frayed like this is where you can do a little dry brush technique. Or I've got a really thick brush like this that's nice to do this with. When you get to this point where your paint's kind of thick and tacky like this, and if you have, something like this similar to what's happening on mine, where it's just getting a little, oh no, it's just not working for me. I want to like blend. I'm going to use a dry brush with this thick brush, and I'm just going to go around and kind of feather it out a little bit using like a scrubby motion. And I'm still thinking about those contours as I do it. And this is just kind of create some unity and some soften these edges a little bit. And just make it feel a little more cohesive where it was starting to get away from me a little bit there. I'm just getting all those, I kind of lost some of I lost a little bit of something there, but what I gained in making it all feel nice and like it's all one form now. So using a little dry brush technique to just like soften and blend, because I'm definitely rushing through these layers faster than I would and was ending up with kind of a weird patchiness that I'm not into. So just softening all of that, these little transitions, creating kind of a atmospheric situation on the mango. Okay. So now I'm gonna have to put some of that back in. We've got 15 minutes to do it and get these last layers on there a little bit. I think I can do it. Okay, so maybe I'll just go ahead and jump to the stand oil. I'm gonna put the linseed oil away. And I'm gonna make that, that yellow kind of peachy color, maybe just a yellow. I'm gonna mix up both of my yellows together first. So mostly the lemon yellow. I'm gonna add a little bit of white to it as well first. And that may be all you want to do. You might like the way the yellow with just a little bit of white looks. But if you want to add a little bit of the cadmium yellow hue to it as well, be my guest. If you want to use more of that peachy color that we made earlier, that might be nice. The peachy color, I feel like just gave it a little bit of like an accent feeling. And it's hard to spot the peachy color in my actual mango reference, but I feel like it made sense to me before. So I'm going to do it again. I'm going to take my stand oil and pour some of that on there. I'm just pouring it directly on my brush again. I'm mostly doing that because I don't want it to spill all down my drafting table here. You can pour a little pile on your palette and then slowly add it to your color, or slowly add your color to it. However you want to do it. You're going to see it's real thick, like honey or molasses. And I know that's not showing up too much on the screen right now, but I assure you it's very thick. Okay, and then so when I put it on, it's just, yeah, it's going to kind of stand there. So this is where, like when students go so thick with their paint that they're not able to, get any details to happen because it's like, so everything's so wet. It's like, well, use a little bit of stand oil and you can get a layer on there that's going to like really just stand up on its own. So the word stand is a really good description of what it's doing. So I really liked how that looked before to add all that yellow back in. So I'm going to do that same thing again, even if I'm not seeing this much yellow on here. And the thicker I go with it, the more it's going to stand on top of the other layers. Like if I went kind of not so thin or not so thick with it on my paintbrush, it didn't really do that thing. But if I get a really thick glob of it with the paint and the stand oil, then I can really get it to just stand on top, right? Okay, and then we never did paint our little stem over here. Let me go ahead and paint my stem a little bit with some brown while I'm thinking about it. And I could even take my brown and add some stand oil to it if I wanted it to feel nice and thick. The other thing you can do with the stand oil is glazing. So glazing is where you, I mean, it to just demonstrate the glazing a little bit with like the brown. So let me add some stand oil to some brown. I'm gonna make some brown again first. Let me see if I can just turn this green pile into brown quickly. Yeah, I did. Okay. So glazing is where you take a layer of something over something that's kind of dry, which this is not totally dry, but since I dry brushed into it so much, I made it very thin. I might be able to do a little bit of glazing. Let's see. Glazing is where you take, more of like a transparent layer on top of a layer that's mostly dry, and it's going to affect the layer underneath, but the layer underneath is going to shine through. So see if I can get it to happen here with the brown. Yeah. So see how it's just kind of, I mean, the layer underneath is not dry, so it's not having the exact same effect as it would if it was dry. Okay, let's do some of these black dots and then some of these yellow dots, and I think we're gonna call it a night. So I'm gonna take the same pile of this yellow with the stand oil. I feel like I wanted that whole demonstration to be a lot more dramatic and climactic than it was, but like that's as good as it's gonna get when that layer underneath is still wet, y'all. Okay, so I've got my stand oil pretty thick here, this white or this white and yellow, and I had a touch of pink to it. It was looking a little peachy. So I've got it loaded up on my brush. So now I should be able to just go around and do some nice little dots of yellow. This would work a lot easier if that red was a little more dry and not so thick. But it is what it is. But we're just looking for some of the, yeah, there we go. We got it to be in that spot where it's a little not so thick paint. I'm making it happen. So that's how I'm getting those little fun yellow dots on there for all that texture that I'm seeing on the mango. And I just realized I abandoned my stem a little while ago. I might add another layer to this red if I had more time, but I'm gonna just leave it like that. Okay, and then these black dots, remember we said we can do this with the black or we can do it with that violet. So, and you could also add some violet to your darker shadows too, if you wanted. So let me take my red and my blue and make a little violet again. And then get some stand oil on that. But yeah, we're just manipulating the consistency with these mediums to allow us to do things that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do. Because if I tried to do this without the stand oil, it's very unlikely that that yellow is not gonna just stick up like it did. You know, it's not gonna stand on top of there like it just did with the stand oil. But since I have the stand oil with it, it's doing that. And then I can do the same thing with, oh, yikes. Somehow there was some water that bled in there first. So it didn't quite do the thing I'm looking for. I'm looking for that same little jammy thing. There we go. So yeah, it's very sticky. I'm just letting that stickiness work its magic. Go back to that brown for a second and see if I can finish the stem real quick. Mixing a little bit of my brown with this yellow concoction that I had to make a lighter brown. It's pretty good. All right. I feel like I almost got as far as I did with the other example, y'all. I'm gonna go back to the other example for just a second so you can see the differences of when I had a little more time. But yeah, you can see where I did that glazing thing with the brown and the stand oil, and it just gave it this very like glossy feel because I used a lot of stand oil in those last layers, and I went over it with like a whole last layer of orange and red and yellow and green. I mean, I just glazed over the whole thing and it gave it that really nice, fun, glossy feel. And then I dabbed in the black dots and the yellow dots, and it really had a fun effect. And then, yeah, I hung it up to dry on the wall and some of it dripped down and I got a little issue right there, but definitely like let it lay flat until it's dry so you don't have things like that happen if you go super thick with it like I did. But that's pretty much it for me. I'm going to switch to my forward facing view and I'd love to see some of y'all's examples. If you want to hold up your example, we can spotlight you and see where you landed on this mango. And then we have a couple of minutes if anybody had any other questions that I could answer about this process. Oh, look at that, Laura. That's gorgeous. Yes. Yeah, don't, oh, and I forgot to mention, I didn't put up my business cards tonight and my hashtags, but yeah, don't forget to hashtag Make It With Michael's or Michael's Classes, or tag me at Adrian Hodge Art. Let me make sure I get that on the screen before we're done. And there's Barbara's. Okay, yeah, it might have been getting a little wet there, Barbara. I think maybe you could let things like stay thin, or maybe even if it's too muddy for you, you can always wipe it out with a paper towel and go back in with really thin layers. I know it's challenging when you get too thick and that muddiness can start to happen, but it was really nice. All right, and there's Donna. Yeah, I can see we're going in with some thicker paint on that green and brown there. It's a nice transition from those colors. Oh, okay, that's it. Yeah, let me switch back to my tabletop view for just a second and share that. So those hashtags, Make It With Michael's or Michael's Classes, and you can follow me on Instagram at Adrian Hodge Art, and my link tree is in my bio on my Instagram. You can check out some other classes that I have coming up. I have a online portrait drawing for beginners class that I'm starting this Saturday on Zoom. And if Ilse has my link tree, she could drop that in the chat real quick for you. Or you can just go to my Instagram at Adrian Hodge Art and click on the link tree in my bio if you want to check out some other stuff that I have going on. But I'll be back with these Michael's classes in August, and we'll be doing drawing lips using the planes of the face and some urban sketching tips and tricks. We just have 2 classes in August since I did 4 classes in July here. So thank you all so much, and thank you, Ilse, and y'all have a wonderful evening. Thanks for